The sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon when John Miller eased his 18-wheeler onto the interstate. The cab's heater struggled against the biting cold of a Midwest winter, and John's breath misted in front of him as he settled in for another long haul. The highway stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through snow-covered fields that seemed to glow faintly in the pre-dawn light. John had been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and the road had become his home more than the small apartment he kept back in Omaha. At 53, his face was weathered from years of squinting into the sun, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd worked hard his entire life. But it was his eyes that told the real story, deep brown pools that held a mixture of weariness and an unquenchable spark of kindness. As he drove, John's thoughts drifted, as they often did on these solitary mornings, to Catherine. His late wife had been gone for 3 years now, but her absence still felt raw, like a wound that refused to heal completely. She had been his anchor, his reason for coming home after weeks on the road. Now, the thought of that empty apartment made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. "You've got angel eyes, John Miller," Catherine used to tell him, usually when he'd done something kind without thinking twice about it. "You see the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves." He'd always brush off the compliment with a gruff laugh, but deep down, those words meant the world to him. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking through his reverie. "Breaker 19, this here's Rusty Nail. Any of you good buddies got eyes on any bears in the bushes?" The familiar trucker lingo brought a small smile to John's face. He reached for the MIC, ready to respond, when something caught his eye. Off to the side of the road, barely visible in the weak light of dawn, was a flash of movement. John's foot eased off the accelerator, his eyes straining to make out what he'd seen. As he slowed, the shape became clearer, a dog, its golden fur matted and dirty, huddled against the cold. And there, nestled against her, were several tiny forms. John's heart sank. He knew he should keep driving. His schedule was tight, and stopping could mean missing his delivery window. But Catherine's voice echoed in his mind, clear as day, "Angels are everywhere, John. Sometimes, they just look a little different." With a sigh that was equal parts resignation and determination, John eased his rig onto the shoulder. The rumble of the engine died away, leaving only the whistle of the wind across the empty fields. He zipped up his heavy coat and pulled on his gloves before stepping out into the frigid morning air. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath for a moment. Snow crunched under his boots as he made his way towards the dogs, moving slowly to avoid startling them. As he got closer, he could see the mother dog more clearly. She was a golden retriever, or at least mostly so, though her coat was so dirty and tangled it was hard to tell for sure. Her ribs showed through her fur, and her eyes held a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Huddled against her were 4 puppies, their tiny bodies shivering despite their mother's attempts to shield them from the wind. John's heart broke at the sight. He crouched down, keeping his movements slow and gentle. "Hey there, girl," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're in a tough spot, aren't you?" The mother dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but she didn't move. Her eyes never left John's face as he slowly extended his hand, palm up, letting her catch his scent. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, the dog's tail gave a small wag. That tiny gesture of trust was all John needed. With gentle hands, he scooped up the smallest puppy, a runt that seemed to be struggling more than the others. Its eyes weren't even open yet, and it felt as light as a feather in his large, calloused hands. "It's okay, little one," John murmured, tucking the puppy inside his coat. "I've got you." One by one, he gathered the puppies, tucking them safely inside his coat. The mother dog watched warily but didn't protest, as if she understood that this strange human was trying to help. Finally, John held out his arms to her. "Come on, girl," he said. "Let's get you out of this cold." For a heartbeat, the dog hesitated. Then, with a whine that seemed to convey both relief and gratitude, she stood on shaky legs and allowed John to lift her. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel every rib as he cradled her against his chest. The walk back to the truck seemed to take forever, the wind cutting through John's coat as if it wasn't even there. By the time he reached the cab, his arms were aching from the cold and the weight of the dogs. But as he carefully settled them onto the passenger seat, wrapping them in the old blanket he kept for emergencies, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the truck's heater. As John climbed back into the driver's seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was red from the cold, his salt and pepper hair tousled by the wind. But his eyes, there was something in them he hadn't seen in a long time. A spark of purpose, of life. He glanced at the dogs, now huddled together on the seat beside him. The mother dog met his gaze, and in her eyes, John saw a reflection of his own weariness, his own loneliness. But he also saw something else, a resilience, a determination to keep going no matter what. As he pulled back onto the highway, John found himself talking to the dogs, his voice filling the cab with a warmth it hadn't known in years. "You know," he said, "my Catherine always said that angels come in all shapes and sizes. I think she'd say you folks qualify." The mother dog's tail thumped weakly against the seat, as if in agreement. John chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in years. He didn't know what he was going to do with 5 dogs, or how this unexpected detour would affect his schedule. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, John Miller drove on. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he wasn't alone anymore. And somehow, that made all the difference in the world. The old Chevy truck stop loomed out of the swirling snow like a lighthouse in a storm. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting an uneven blue glow across the empty parking lot. John Miller eased his rig into the lot, the engine's rumble cutting through the eerie silence of the winter morning. As he pulled up to the fuel pumps, John glanced at his unexpected passengers. The mother dog was curled protectively around her puppies, all of them nestled in the old army blanket he'd dug out from behind his seat. Her eyes met his, and John felt a pang in his chest. Those eyes held a world of worry, of fear, but also a glimmer of hope. "Don't you worry, girl," John murmured. "We'll get you folks taken care of." The bell above the door jingled as John stepped into the truck stop. The warm air inside was a shock after the biting cold, and he stamped his feet, shaking off snow. "Well, I'll be damned," a familiar voice called out. "If it ain't John Miller, large as life and twice as ugly." John grinned as he looked up to see Pete Johnson behind the counter. Pete was a fixture at the truck stop, as permanent as the cracked linoleum floor and the smell of diesel and coffee that hung in the air. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. "Pete," John nodded, making his way to the counter. "Good to see you, old-timer. How's tricks?" Pete snorted. Same old, same old. World's going to hell in a handbasket, but the coffee's still hot and the talk's still cheap." He peered at John over the top of his reading glasses. "You're running late today. That ain't like you, John. What's the hold-up?" John hesitated for a moment. He and Pete went way back, but he wasn't sure how the old man would react to his impromptu rescue mission. Still, if anyone would understand, it'd be Pete. "I picked up some hitchhikers," John said finally. "Found them on the side of the road, about 10 miles back. Couldn't just leave em there in the cold." Pete's eyebrows shot up. "Hitchhikers? In this weather? They must be crazier than a bag of cats." John shook his head. "Not people, Pete. Dogs. A mama and 4 pups. They were half frozen out there." For a moment, Pete just stared at him. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "John Miller, you old softy. Catherine always said you had a heart as big as Texas." The mention of Catherine's name sent a familiar ache through John's chest, but it was softer now, tempered by the warmth of memory. "Yeah, well," he mumbled, feeling his ears grow hot. "Couldn't just drive by, you know?" Pete nodded, his expression turning serious. "You did good, John. But what are you gonna do with them now? Can't exactly take a litter of pups on your run with you." John ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling the weight of his impulsive decision. "I don't know, Pete. I didn't really think that far ahead. Just knew I had to get em out of the cold." Pete was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the counter. Then he straightened up, decision made. "All right, here's what we're gonna do. Bring em in here. We've got that old storeroom in the back. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. We can set 'em up there for now, figure out the rest later. Relief washed over John. You sure, Pete? I don't want to put you out. Pete waved away his concerns. Ain't no bother. Besides, it'll give me something to do other than watch the snow fall. Now go on, get those dogs inside before they freeze to their whiskers. John didn't need to be told twice. He hurried back out to his truck, the cold biting at his exposed skin. The mother dog looked up as he opened the door, her tail giving a weak thump. All right, girl, John said softly. Let's get you and your little ones somewhere warm. It took some doing, but John managed to gather all the dogs into his arms. The mother dog was too weak to walk on her own, so he cradled her against his chest, her puppies nestled in the folds of the blanket. Back inside, Pete had already sprung into action. He led John to a small room at the back of the truck stop, usually used for storing extra supplies. Now, it had been hastily transformed into a makeshift shelter. Old towels and blankets were piled in one corner, creating a soft nest. A space heater hummed in another corner, already warming the small space. It ain't the Ritz, Pete said as John gently set the dogs down on the makeshift bed, but it'll do for now. The mother dog sniffed around cautiously before settling down, her puppies immediately huddling close to her. John watched them for a moment, feeling a lump form in his throat. They looked so small, so vulnerable. They need food, he said, suddenly realizing how thin the mother dog was. And water. And probably a vet, too. Pete nodded. I've got some canned dog food in the back. It's for my old hound, but he won't mind sharing. As for a vet, he trailed off, his brow furrowing in thought. There's a clinic in town, about 20 miles from here. Run by a young lady, Dr. Morales. She's good people. I can give her a call, see if she can come out. John nodded gratefully. Thanks, Pete. I owe you one. Pete waved him off. Or, hell, John. You don't owe me nothing. This is what folks do. We look out for each other, and for those who can't look out for themselves. As Pete went to fetch the food and make the call, John knelt down beside the dogs. The mother dog watched him warily, but there was less fear in her eyes now. Hesitantly, John reached out, letting her sniff his hand before gently scratching behind her ears. You're safe now, he murmured. You and your little ones. We're gonna get you all fixed up. One of the puppies, the little runt John had picked up first, squirmed its way over to him. Its eyes were open now, revealing a startling blue that would likely darken with age. It nuzzled against John's hand, its tiny tail wagging. Something shifted in John's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It had been a long time since he'd felt needed, since he'd had someone, or something, depending on him. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Pete returned with a can of dog food and a bowl of water. As they watched the mother dog eat, her hunger overcoming her caution, Pete cleared his throat. You know, he said slowly, there's been talk lately. Rumors, really. About dogs being abandoned out on the highways. John looked up sharply. What do you mean? Pete sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-odd years. There's been others, John. Other dogs found out there, usually moms with pups. And they all got one thing in common, they look like they come from breeders. Good breeds, you know? Not your average mutts. John felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter seeping into his bones. You think someone's dumping them on purpose? But why? Pete shrugged. Can't say for sure. But there's whispers about an old breeding operation. Place called Golden Paws Labs. They got shut down a few years back for some real nasty practices. Overbreeding, poor conditions, that sort of thing. Word is, they might have started up again, underground-like. John's jaw clenched, anger rising in him like a tide. He looked at the mother dog, at her puppies, and felt a fierce protectiveness wash over him. That's not right, Pete. It ain't right at all. Pete nodded solemnly. No, it ain't. But proving it, that's the hard part. Cops can't do much with just rumors and a few abandoned dogs. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft whimpering of the puppies as they nursed. John's mind was racing, thoughts and half-formed plans tumbling over each other. Finally, he spoke. "I need to know more, Pete. About these rumors, about Golden Paws. All of it." Pete studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, John. I'll tell you what I know. But you gotta promise me something." "What's that?" "Be careful," Pete said, his voice grave. "If there's truth to these rumors, we're talking about folks who don't mind treating dogs like disposable goods. No telling what they'd do to a person who starts poking around." John looked down at the dogs, at the trust in the mother's eyes as she gazed up at him. He thought about Catherine, about the way she'd always stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "I hear you, Pete," he said quietly. "But I can't just walk away from this. I gotta do something." As if in agreement, the runt puppy let out a tiny bark, more of a squeak really. Despite the seriousness of the moment, John couldn't help but smile. "All right then," Pete said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Let's figure this out together. But first, let's get these dogs settled." Dr. Morales said she'd be here within the hour. As they set about making the dogs more comfortable, John felt a sense of purpose settling over him. He didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew he had to follow it. For the dogs, for Catherine's memory, and for himself. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the small storeroom of a nondescript truck stop, a different kind of storm was brewing. One that would change John Miller's life forever. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having blown itself out overnight. John Miller stood in the parking lot of Pete's truck stop, watching his breath mist in the frigid air. He'd spent the night in his cab, unwilling to leave the dogs alone in a strange place. Now, as the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, John felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning in his gut. Dr. Eliza Morales had arrived late the previous evening, her ancient Subaru chugging into the lot with a wheezing rattle that made John wince in sympathy. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes that held a warmth that immediately put John at ease. She'd spent hours examining the dogs, her gentle hands and soothing voice calming even the most skittish of the puppies. Now, as John saw her car pulling into the lot once more, he straightened up, eager for news. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Dr. Morales called as she climbed out of her car, a steaming travel mug in one hand and a battered leather bag in the other. "How are our patients doing this morning?" John couldn't help but smile at the way she said "our patients," as if he was somehow part of this impromptu veterinary team. "Seem to be doing okay, document. The mama ate a bit more this morning, and the pups are getting livelier." Dr. Morales nodded approvingly as they made their way inside. "That's good news. Proper nutrition and warmth can work wonders." Inside the makeshift shelter, the mother dog wagged her tail weakly at their approach. The puppies, still wobbly on their feet, tumbled over each other in their excitement. All except one, the runt, which John had started thinking of as Ben, lay curled up against his mother's side. Dr. Morales' face softened as she knelt beside the dogs. "Hey there, sweethearts," she murmured, letting the mother sniff her hand before gently examining each puppy in turn. When she got to Ben, her brow furrowed slightly. "This little one's still struggling," she said, her voice laced with concern. "He's not as responsive as I'd like." John felt his heart clench. "But he'll be okay, right? With proper care and all." Dr. Morales looked up at him, her eyes kind but serious. "I'm going to do everything I can, Mr. Miller. But he's very weak. The next 48 hours will be critical." John nodded, swallowing hard. He'd known these dogs for less than a day, but already the thought of losing one of them was almost unbearable. As Dr. Morales continued her examination, Pete joined them, carrying a tray of coffee cups. "Thought you folks could use some fuel," he said, handing out the steaming cups. "How are they doing, Doc?" Dr. Morales straightened up, accepting the coffee gratefully. "They're survivors, that's for sure. But they've been through a lot. The mother shows signs of multiple pregnancies in a short time frame, which is consistent with overbreeding. And all of them are malnourished and showing signs of neglect." John's jaw clenched, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "It's those bastards at Golden Paws, isn't it? The ones Pete was telling me about." Dr. Morales' expression turned grim. I can't say for certain, but yes, it's possible. The signs are consistent with what we've seen in other dogs rescued from puppy mills. She hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Listen, there's something you both should know. These dogs, they're not the first I've seen like this. Over the past few months, we've had several cases of abandoned dogs, mostly mothers with puppies, all showing similar signs of neglect and overbreeding. Pete nodded slowly. That fits with the rumors I've been hearing. But if you've been seeing this, Doc, why haven't the authorities done anything? Dr. Morales sighed, running a hand through her hair. We've reported every case, but without concrete evidence linking the dogs to a specific operation, there's not much they can do. These puppy mills, they're smart. They dump the dogs in different locations, often across county lines. Makes it hard to build a case. John felt his resolve hardening. Well, we can't just sit back and do nothing. There's gotta be something we can do. Dr. Morales looked at him thoughtfully. Actually, there might be. I've been working with a local animal rescue group, trying to gather information. We've been piecing together fragments, sightings of suspicious vehicles, patterns in where the dogs are found. But we're short on manpower, and... She hesitated, glancing at Pete. And what? John prompted. And we need someone who knows the roads, she finished. Someone who can keep an eye out, maybe track some of these drop-off points. A trucker, maybe. The implication hung in the air. John felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was more than he'd bargained for when he'd pulled over to help a dog and her puppies. But as he looked at the little family huddled in the corner, at Ben struggling to keep up with his siblings, he knew he couldn't walk away. I'm in, he said simply. Pete clapped him on the shoulder. You always did have more heart than sense, John, he said, but his voice was warm with approval. Count me in too. I may be stuck here at the stop, but I've got ears, and truckers talk. I can keep an eye out for any whispers about golden paws or suspicious dog sightings. Dr. Morales looked between the two men, hope dawning in her eyes. Thank you, she said softly. Both of you. This could make a real difference. As they began to plan, discussing routes John could take and what to look out for, he felt a sense of purpose settling over him. It had been a long time since he'd felt this way, like he was part of something bigger than himself. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. John rearranged his routes, taking on more local hauls that would keep him in the area. Dr. Morales provided him with a crash course in what to look for, signs of neglect in dogs, suspicious vehicles, anything that might point to illegal breeding operations. Pete, true to his word, became their eyes and ears at the truck stop. He listened to trucker gossip with new interest, jotting down any mentions of abandoned dogs or strange sightings along the highways. And through it all, the dogs remained at the center of everything. The mother, whom John had started calling Lucy, grew stronger each day. Her golden coat began to regain its luster, and her eyes lost their haunted look. The puppies thrived under the constant care, their playful antics bringing smiles to everyone who saw them. All except Ben. The runt of the litter continued to struggle, needing round-the-clock care and special formula. John found himself spending every spare moment with the tiny pup, willing him to fight, to grow stronger. It was during one of these late-night vigils, as John sat on the floor of the makeshift shelter with Ben cradled in his hands, that he had his first breakthrough. He'd been on the road all day, keeping his eyes peeled for anything suspicious. As he'd pulled into a rest stop for a quick break, he'd noticed a van parked in a far corner of the lot. There was nothing obviously suspicious about it, but something had niggled at the back of John's mind. Now, as he replayed the scene in his head, it clicked. The van had been clean, too clean for a vehicle that had been driving in the slushy, salt-covered roads. And there had been a faint sound coming from it, a sound that he now realized had been whimpering. Son of a bitch, John muttered, careful to keep his voice low so as not to disturb the sleeping dogs. He fumbled for his phone, quickly dialing Dr. Morales' number. John, her voice was groggy with sleep. Is everything okay? Is it Ben? No, Ben's fine, John assured her quickly. But I think I might have seen something today. A van at the Highway 20 rest stop. I think there might have been dogs inside. Dr. Morales was instantly alert. Are you sure? Did you get a license plate? John cursed inwardly. No, I didn't think of it at the time. But I remember it was white, one of those panel vans with no windows in the back. Had some kind of logo on the side, but I couldn't make it out. Okay, that's still helpful, Dr. Morales said. I'll call my contact at the sheriff's department, see if they can send someone to check it out. Good work, John. As he hung up, John looked down at Ben, who had fallen asleep in his palm. We're gonna get them, little guy, he whispered. We're gonna stop this. What John didn't know was that his actions had not gone unnoticed. As he'd driven away from the rest stop earlier that day, the driver of the white van had watched him go, a frown creasing his features. He'd picked up a burner phone, dialing a number from memory. Boss. Yeah, it's me. We might have a problem. There's a trucker, been asking questions. Yeah, big guy, salt and pepper hair. Drives a blue Peterbilt. What do you want me to do? The answer, when it came, sent a chill down the man's spine. This simple operation was about to get a lot more complicated. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, John Miller sat in the quiet of the makeshift shelter, unaware that he had just taken the first step down a path that would change his life forever. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but as he looked at the sleeping dogs around him, John knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The fight for justice had begun, and John Miller was right in the middle of it. The weeks that followed John's discovery at the rest stop were a whirlwind of activity. His life, once a predictable rhythm of long hauls and quiet nights, had transformed into something he barely recognized. But for the first time in years, John felt truly alive. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. John's truck became more than just his livelihood, it was now a mobile command center in their fight against golden paws. He'd rigged up a series of cameras, carefully hidden in the cab and trailer, ready to capture any suspicious activity he might encounter on the road. Pete's truck stop had become their unofficial headquarters. The old storeroom, still home to Lucy and her puppies, now sported a corkboard covered in maps, photos, and scraps of information. It looked like something out of a crime show, and John often caught Pete staring at it with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Never thought I'd see the day, Pete would mutter, shaking his head. My truck stop, center of a proper investigation. Catherine would have loved this, John. The mention of Catherine no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, John felt a warm glow, as if his late wife was somehow watching over their efforts, offering her silent approval. Dr. Morales had become a constant presence in their lives. She split her time between caring for the recovering dogs and coordinating with local animal rescue groups. Her passion was infectious, and John found himself looking forward to their strategy sessions, even when they stretched late into the night. It was during one of these late-night meetings that they had their next big break. John had just returned from a 3-day haul, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue but bright with excitement. I think I found something, he announced, spreading out a series of photographs on the table. There's this warehouse, about 50 miles north of here. I've passed it a dozen times before and never thought twice about it. But look. The photos showed a nondescript building, the kind you'd see in any industrial park. But John pointed to a series of details, heavy security cameras, blacked-out windows, and most tellingly, a barely visible logo on one of the vans parked outside. It's the same van I saw at the rest stop, John said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. I'm sure of it. Dr. Morales leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration. This could be it, she said slowly. The layout matches what we've heard from other rescues. Isolated location, heavy security, it fits the profile. Pete let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. You might have just cracked this thing wide open, John. But their elation was short-lived. As they began to plan their next move, discussing how to gather more concrete evidence to take to the authorities, John's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stay out of it, trucker. Last warning. The atmosphere in the room changed in an instant. The excitement of moments before was replaced by a tense silence as the reality of what they were dealing with sank in. They know, John said quietly, showing the others the message. Somehow, they've made me. Dr. Morales' face paled. This is serious, John. These people, They're not just going to roll over and give up. They're making millions from this operation. They'll do whatever it takes to protect it. Pete's weathered face was grim. Maybe it's time to step back, let the proper authorities handle this. You've done more than enough, John. No one would blame you for walking away now. For a moment, John was tempted. He thought of his quiet life on the road, the simplicity of it. He thought of the danger he was putting himself in, of what Catherine would say if she knew. But then his gaze fell on the corkboard, covered in evidence of their investigation. He thought of Lucy and her puppies, of Ben who was finally starting to thrive. He thought of all the other dogs out there, suffering at the hands of people who saw them as nothing more than a commodity. No, John said, his voice firm. I can't walk away. Not now. We're too close. Dr. Morales nodded, a mix of relief and worry on her face. Okay. But we need to be smart about this. No more lone wolf stuff, John. We do this together, and we do it carefully. Over the next few days, they formulated a plan. John would continue his routes as normal, but now he'd be wired for sound, courtesy of some equipment Dr. Morales borrowed from a friend in law enforcement. Pete would monitor the CB radio, listening for any chatter about golden paws or suspicious activity along the highways. It was a solid plan, but as John climbed into his truck for his next haul, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with fire. The weight of the hidden microphone felt heavy against his chest, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. As he pulled out of the truck stop, John's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a dark sedan pull out behind him, but when he looked again, the road was empty. Shaking his head, John focused on the road ahead. He had a job to do. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and watchfulness. John's routes took him past the suspicious warehouse several times, and each pass made his heart race. He noted down everything he saw, the comings and goings of vehicles, the patterns of activity around the building. It was on the third day that things took a turn. John had pulled into a rest stop for a quick break when he noticed two men approaching his truck. They were trying to look casual, but John's instincts, honed by years on the road, were screaming danger. Hey there, one of the men called out as John stepped down from his cab. That's a nice rig you got. Mind if we take a look? John's mind raced. These men weren't truckers, that much was clear. Their clothes were too new, their hands too soft. Sorry, fellas, he said, keeping his voice level. I'm on a tight schedule. No time for show and tell. The second man's face hardened. Now, that's not very neighborly. We just want to have a friendly chat. About dogs, maybe. Heard you've taken quite an interest in them lately. John's blood ran cold, but he kept his face impassive. Don't know what you're talking about. Now, if you'll excuse me. He made to step around them, but the first man grabbed his arm. Listen here, trucker. This is your last chance to mind your own business. Next time, we won't be so friendly. For a moment, John was tempted to throw a punch, to let out all the frustration and anger that had been building up. But he thought of Dr. Morales' words. Be smart. Be careful. This is my business, John said, his voice low and intense. Those dogs, they can't speak for themselves. So I'm speaking for them. And I ain't gonna stop. The men exchanged glances, clearly thrown by John's response. Before they could react, the sound of an approaching vehicle made them step back. A family minivan pulled into the rest stop, kids' voices spilling out into the quiet morning. This isn't over, the second man hissed before they both turned and walked away, disappearing into a dark sedan parked at the far end of the lot. John's hands were shaking as he climbed back into his truck. He fumbled for his phone, dialing Dr. Morales' number. They approached me, he said as soon as she picked up. Two men, at the Highway 40 rest stop. They knew about the dogs, Eliza. They're on to us. Dr. Morales' sharp intake of breath was audible even over the phone. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? No, I'm fine, John assured her. But they made it clear this was my last warning. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Dr. Morales spoke again, her voice was filled with resolve. This ends now, John. We've got enough to take to the authorities. I'm calling my contact at the sheriff's department. "We're bringing Golden Paws down." As John hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and trepidation. They were close, so close to ending this. But he knew the most dangerous part was still to come. Starting up his truck, John pulled back onto the highway. In his mind, he could hear Catherine's voice, as clear as if she were sitting right beside him. "You're doing the right thing, John. Don't you dare give up now." With renewed determination, John pressed down on the accelerator. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Golden Paws' days were numbered, and John Miller was going to make sure of it. As the miles rolled by beneath his wheels, John's resolve hardened. He'd started this journey to save a few dogs on the side of the road, but it had become something much bigger. It had become a fight for justice, a stand against cruelty and greed. And come what may, John was going to see it through to the end. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But John Miller had never been more sure of his path. With the memory of Catherine in his heart and the thought of all the dogs counting on him, he drove on into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The day of the raid dawned cold and grey, a fitting backdrop for the tense atmosphere that had settled over Pete's truck stop. John Miller stood in the parking lot, his breath misting in the early morning air as he watched a convoy of police vehicles roll in. The culmination of weeks of investigation, of long nights and dangerous encounters, had finally arrived. Sheriff Tom Hawkins, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper mustache, approached John with purposeful strides. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending a hand. "I want to thank you for your work on this case. It's not often we get civilians willing to put themselves on the line like this." John shook the offered hand, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. "Just doing what needed to be done, Sheriff. Those dogs, they needed someone to speak up for them." The sheriff nodded, his eyes serious. "Well, thanks to you and Dr. Morales, we've got enough evidence for a warrant. We're going to shut Golden Paws down for good." As if summoned by her name, Dr. Morales pulled up in her battered Subaru, a team of animal rescue workers following in a van behind her. She jumped out, her face a mix of determination and anxiety. "John," she called, jogging over. "Are you ready for this?" John took a deep breath, steeling himself. "As ready as I'll ever be, document." The plan was simple, at least on paper. John would lead the convoy to the warehouse in his truck, playing the role of an unsuspecting driver making a routine delivery. Once he was inside, the police would move in, using the element of surprise to their advantage. As John climbed into his familiar cab, he felt a moment of surreal disbelief. How had he, a simple long-haul trucker, ended up at the center of a police raid? But then he thought of Lucy and her puppies, of Ben who was finally starting to thrive, and he knew exactly how. Sometimes, life puts you exactly where you need to be. The drive to the warehouse felt both endless and far too short. John's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. What if something went wrong? What if the Golden Paws people had been tipped off? What if? He shook his head, forcing the doubts away. It was too late for second-guessing now. He had a job to do. As the warehouse came into view, John felt a chill run down his spine. It looked exactly the same as it had every other time he'd driven past, and yet now, knowing what lay inside, it seemed ominous and foreboding. John pulled up to the gate, forcing a casual smile as he rolled down his window. "Morning," he called to the guard. "Got a delivery for you folks." The guard looked bored as he checked a clipboard. "Don't see anything scheduled for today." John shrugged, the picture of nonchalance. "Last-minute order, I guess. You know how it is." For a heart-stopping moment, John thought the guard was going to turn him away. But then the man shrugged and waved him through. "Go on in." Loading docks round back. As John pulled around to the back of the warehouse, he could see the police vehicles moving into position, hidden just out of sight. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure everyone must be able to hear it. He backed his trailer up to the loading dock with practiced ease, then climbed down from the cab. A man in a cheap suit approached, clipboard in hand. "You're not our usual driver," the man said, suspicion clear in his voice. John forced a laugh. "Nah, just filling in today." "So, where do you want these crates?" The man opened his mouth to reply, But his words were drowned out by the sudden wail of police sirens. In an instant, the quiet morning erupted into chaos. Police cars swarmed into the lot, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. Police. Everyone freeze. The man in the suit turned to run, but John, acting on instinct, tackled him to the ground. "I don't think so, buddy," he growled. All around, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Officers were securing suspects, while others were already entering the warehouse. John could hear barking from inside, the sound sending a surge of anger and determination through him. Dr. Morales and her team were right behind the police, ready to care for the dogs they knew they would find. As she passed John, she squeezed his shoulder. "You did it, John. We did it." For the next few hours, John felt like he was in a daze. He watched as dog after dog was brought out of the warehouse, each one in worse condition than the last. The sight of their matted fur, their frightened eyes, and their too-thin bodies made his heart ache. But there was hope too. He saw the gentle way Dr. Morales and her team handled each animal, the immediate care they provided. He saw the determination in the eyes of the police officers, their faces grim as they catalogued evidence and arrested the Golden Paws staff. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Sheriff Hawkins approached John again. "Mr. Miller, we're going to need your statement, but it can wait until tomorrow. You've done enough for today." John nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion. But as he turned to leave, a commotion near one of the rescue vans caught his attention. "We've got another one," a voice called out. "Looks like she just had puppies." Without thinking, John jogged over. There, being gently lifted from the van, was a golden retriever, her coat dull and her body painfully thin. But it was her eyes that caught John's attention. They were filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that reminded him of Lucy. "Hey there, girl," John said softly, approaching slowly. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and her tail gave a tentative wag. Dr. Morales appeared at his side. "She's in rough shape, John. But I think she's going to be okay." "They all are, thanks to you." John felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't do it alone, document. We all did this." As they stood there, watching the last of the rescued dogs being loaded into transport vans, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be court cases and continued care for the rescued dogs. But they had struck a major blow against animal cruelty today. Later that night, as John sat in the quiet of Pete's truck stop, he found himself thinking about Catherine. He could almost hear her voice, filled with pride. "I always knew you had it in you, John. You've got angel eyes, remember?" He chuckled softly, reaching down to scratch behind Ben's ears. The once frail puppy was now a bundle of energy, racing around with his siblings under Lucy's watchful eye. "You were right, Kathy," he whispered. "Angels are everywhere. Sometimes they just look a little different." As if in response, Ben let out a tiny bark, his tail wagging furiously. John laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. The road ahead was still long. There were more fights to be fought, more dogs to be saved. But John Miller was ready for it. He had found his purpose, his family, in the most unexpected of places. And as he sat there, surrounded by the dogs he had saved and the friends he had made, John knew that this was just the beginning of a new journey. A journey of healing, of justice, and of love. The night deepened, stars twinkling in the clear sky above. Inside the truck stop, a makeshift family, human and canine alike, rested, safe in the knowledge that they had made a difference. And in that moment, all was right with the world. The months following the raid on Golden Paws passed in a whirlwind of activity. John Miller found himself at the center of a story that captured hearts across the country. Local news stations ran features on the trucker-turned-hero, and even national outlets picked up the tale of the man who had taken on a puppy mill operation single-handedly. But for John, the real work was just beginning. The trial of the Golden Paws operators dragged on for weeks. John spent more time in courtrooms than he ever had on the road, testifying about what he had seen and heard. It was grueling, reliving those tense days of investigation and confrontation. But every time he felt like giving up, he'd remember the dogs they'd saved, and he'd find the strength to continue. Dr. Morales was a constant presence at his side, her testimony as a veterinarian proving crucial in painting a picture of the cruelty the dogs had endured. Together, they watched as the evidence they had gathered was presented, piece by piece, building an ironclad case against Golden Paws. When the verdict finally came down, guilty on all counts, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The ringleaders were sentenced to years in prison, and hefty fines were imposed to help cover the cost of rehabilitating the rescued dogs. But the courtroom victory was just one part of John's new life. Back at Pete's truck stop, which had become something of a community center in the wake of the Golden Paws case, John found himself surrounded by a makeshift family he never expected to have. Lucy and her puppies, including the now thriving Ben, had become permanent residents. Pete had grumblingly agreed to let them stay, though his frequent treats and belly rubs belied his supposed reluctance. The old storeroom had been transformed into a cozy living space for the dogs, complete with beds, toys, and a doggy door that led to a fenced outdoor area. John's long-haul routes had become a thing of the past. Instead, he found himself taking on local deliveries, allowing him to return to the truck stop, and his canine family every night. His big rig, once his only companion on lonely highways, now often carried precious cargo in the form of rescued dogs being transported to loving homes across the state. One crisp fall morning, as John sat on the steps of his truck, sipping coffee and watching Lucy play with her now-grown puppies, Dr. Morales pulled up in her Subaru. She'd become a frequent visitor to the truck stop, her visits ostensibly to check on the dogs but increasingly to share a cup of coffee and conversation with John. "Morning, John," she called, a smile lighting up her face. "How are our stars doing today?" John chuckled, gesturing to the playful group of dogs. "See for yourself. They've got more energy than I know what to do with." Eliza settled beside him on the steps, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the dogs romp in the early morning light. "You know," Eliza said finally, "I've been thinking. The work we did with Golden Paws, it made a difference. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more dogs out there that need help." John nodded slowly. He'd been having similar thoughts. The Golden Paws case had opened his eyes to a world of need he'd never fully appreciated before. "What are you thinking, Doc?" Eliza turned to face him, her eyes bright with excitement. "I'm thinking we could do more. Set up a proper rescue operation. Use your contacts in the trucking community to help transport dogs. My veterinary skills to provide care. We could make a real difference, John." The idea took root in John's mind, growing and blossoming with possibilities. He thought of all the highways he'd traveled, all the places where dogs like Lucy might be suffering. He thought of the network of truck stops and fellow drivers who could become a web of support and rescue. "You know," he said slowly, a smile spreading across his face, "I think you might be onto something there, document." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. John and Eliza, with Pete's bemused support, began to transform the truck stop into the headquarters of their new rescue operation. They converted an old storage shed into a temporary shelter, complete with kennels and a basic veterinary setup. John reached out to his contacts in the trucking community, building a network of drivers willing to help transport rescued dogs. They named their organization Highway Heroes, a nod to both John's trucking background and the heroic work they hoped to do. Word spread quickly, and soon they were fielding calls from all over the state about dogs in need. Their first major rescue came just a month after they started. A call came in about a group of dogs abandoned at a rest stop 2 states over. Without hesitation, John climbed into his rig, the trailer now outfitted with comfortable, secure kennels. He drove through the night, his heart racing with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. When he arrived at the rest stop, the sight that greeted him broke his heart. A group of dogs, clearly abandoned and struggling to survive, huddled together near the dumpsters. But as he approached them, speaking softly and offering gentle hands, he saw something in their eyes that he recognized: hope. The drive back to the truck stop was filled with a cacophony of barks and whines, but to John, it was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. When he pulled in, Eliza was waiting, ready to begin examining and treating their new rescues. As John helped unload the dogs, he caught sight of Lucy watching from her favorite spot by the door. Her tail wagged slowly, and in her eyes, John saw understanding. She had once been where these dogs were, scared and alone. Now, she was home, and she seemed to know that these new arrivals would find the same love and care she had. That night, as John sat in his familiar spot on the truck stop steps, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more rescues, more challenges, more heartbreak. But there would also be joy, love, and the satisfaction of knowing they were making a real difference. He thought of Catherine, as he often did in quiet moments like this. He could almost hear her voice, filled with pride. "I always knew you had a bigger purpose, John. Those angel eyes of yours were meant for more than just driving trucks." John smiled, looking out at the highway stretching into the distance. It was the same view he'd seen thousands of times before, but now it held new meaning. Each mile of road was a possibility, a chance to save a life, to make a difference. As if sensing his thoughts, Ben trotted over, now fully grown but still the smallest of Lucy's litter. He placed his head on John's knee, looking up with those soulful eyes that had first captured John's heart on that cold winter morning that seemed a lifetime ago. John scratched behind Ben's ears, chuckling as the dog's tail wagged furiously. "What do you say, buddy? Ready for another adventure?" Ben's enthusiastic bark was all the answer he needed. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. John stood, stretching his back and taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rescues, new chances to make a difference. But for now, he was content. As he headed inside, the dogs following at his heels, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had found his calling, his family, his home. The open road, once a symbol of his solitude, had become a path to connection, to purpose, to love. John Miller, the trucker with angel eyes, had finally found his way home. And the journey, he knew, was only just beginning.